Tracurius woke up early in the morning, for the sun had not yet risen. He expected the room he was in to be cold. He was wrong. After a bit of speculating and searching, he found the source of the warmth. It was a strange white metallic contraption attached to the wall. So the humans also controlled temperature, and it wouldn't surprise him if they also held some control over combustion magic. Sadly, he couldn't find the light switch the human had mentioned the evening prior. He concentrated for a moment and lighted a flame within the palm of his hand, channeling some of his stored-up ternitia into combusting, thus forming the small flame. He scoured around the room, finally finding the switch and diffusing his flame by stopping the ternitia inflow, and put on his robe. He suspected his servants weren't yet awake. It was more near midnight than it was near sunrise, after all. Besides being a diplomat, he was also an accomplished sorcerer and scholar. Educating himself was his responsibility, and so he decided to read a bit. Usually he'd read tomes about the several schools of magic, but he decided to change it up for once. He had always liked studying imperial history and decided to revisit the classics. First up was the Scaldarium. It was a collection of different books written by an infamous dwarven scholar named Finar. It went over the basics, such as the founder of the Imperium, Nachtikal von Reimann, who was a champion of Wutharn and popularized not just the worship of the three gods, Wutharn, god of war and bloodshed, Sanruin, god of pleasure and Logia, goddess of righteous rule and laws, but also that of the emperor of emperors and king of kings, Astrolaic. Furthermore, it also went over how von Reimann gained control over the Imperium, his humble beginnings as a warrior, and how he slew his village's chief, gaining control over the village. Then he asked for Wutharn's patronage, and swore on his honor that he would go into battle undaunted, as would all his children, and spill blood in Wutharn's name. He honored this pledge, slaughtering his way through the world, conquering from the Silver Sea's shores to the riverbanks of the Ulark. So much blood had he spilled that Wutharn named him his peer in skill. By the mortal world he was declared a god, by the gods he was seen as their equal, and even his sworn enemies, the dwarves and Emini, named him the red-handed king, thus creating the imperial cult, who besides the previously named four gods, also venerates Reimann, whose domain is ambition, conquest, and kingship. However, Reimann wasn't just a mindless brute. He was also an adept administrator and governor. Within 10 years, his village went from a small settlement near a river to the capital of his newly founded Imperium, Reimstadt. Reimstadt is still the capital of the Imperium and the largest and most prosperous city in perhaps the entire world. It houses 2 million loyal subjects of the Imperium and is the most populous city in all of the Imperium. Reimann conquered elf, Emini, dwarf, orc, and beastmen. He instituted a universal amount of taxes and levies the various provinces had to pay to their dukes, who would in turn pay half of that to the emperor. After reading for a few hours, the sun had finally risen, and he decided to make use of the human's Schäufer. It was a most refreshing experience. It was like bathing, but standing. The water never got filthy, and he could just sense the purity of it. Following the refreshing experience, he turned the apparatus off and dried himself using a towel near the shower. If they can offer this sheer degree of hospitality to their guests, how prosperous would human cities be then? Perhaps even larger and richer than even Reimstadt itself. After he was done drying himself, he put on his colorful garments. He looked into the mirror and looked at himself for a moment. His deep purple eyes were very common amongst elves. He had hazel-brown hair, something which was rather rare amongst elves. Mirrors were incredibly expensive within the Imperium, and yet according to his servants, all their rooms had them. Maybe the material mirrors were made out of was more common in the human world than it was on Naravor. After he was finished inspecting himself, he stepped outside. It was noticeably colder outside, although still bearable. He did go back inside and pick up his cloak, however. He met up with his knights and went to the grand dining hall the humans called the cafeteria. Maybe this cafeteria was a great human legend or god. There he saw many of his servants already sitting down and eating. He was informed he would be having bacon, eggs, and bread. He also asked for some tea. He didn't know how he could have survived without it all these years. He was talking to a sorcerer about human combustion magic when a human came walking up to him. It was that same Carlson as yesterday. "Sir, the head diplomat will be able to attend to your quarry within 6 hours at 1300 to 1400, longer if necessary," the man said. Confused, Tricurius looked up at him. 1300 to 1400 hours? Is that how you measure time? Tricurius asked Carlson. The human face palmed and handed him a strange device. "That is a watch. It's currently 7:43. The human pointed at one of the clock hands pointing at the 7. The total amount of hours in a human day seemed to be 12 hours long. The second, longer clock hand pointed to 3/4 to the 8. "Interesting," he mumbled to himself. There was also another clock hand, which was constantly moving. It was tracking seconds, so the humans did measure time so accurately it was to the second. The material the watch was made out of confirmed his hypothesis that the humans were filthy rich. It was seemingly actual, pure glass. It was also decorated with gold and silver. It was a magnificent piece of engineering in and of itself, even without the grand decorations. After Tricurius was done marveling at the device, Carlson spoke. "Each day has 24 hours, each hour has 60 minutes, and each minute has 60 seconds. So, his hypothesis about days having 12 hours was false. "You'll need to go to the large red-roofed palace just outside of the gardens when the little clock hand points at the 1, Carlson said. He pointed to the outside, and in the distance, he could see a reasonably sized building with, indeed, a red roof. "If you somehow don't know how to get there, ask anyone," Carlson said, after which he turned around and left. Tricurius put the watch around his wrist. Anyone from Naravor would think he was high royalty with such a magnificent and richly decorated device, which was so well engineered it could measure the time and move on its own without magic. The humans, however, probably thought of this as standard equipment. If they could afford to give one of their guests such a miraculous instrument, without demanding anything in return, then this must be some standard thing for them. After speaking with his servants about the humans' possible goals, eating his meal and asking around where the red-roofed palace was, he finally found it and was ready to begin. He was nervous. That was strange for him. He had been on countless diplomatic missions. Not only that, but he had settled countless conflicts peacefully and without bloodshed. Yet those were petty or lesser races. Petty races being those barely above animals, rat-men, man-bulls, and other such creatures all belonged to this order. Lesser races were those who weren't blessed with divine favor and the grace that only elves had, yet still were important political parties. Emini, dwarves, and orcs all belonged to this category. While yes, elves were numerically inferior, they were intellectually and magically superior. And yet he had the feeling these humans wouldn't be like the lesser or petty races. They moved with as much grace as the average elf, spoke the elven language fluently, or at least it seemed like that, and had a special sort of magic. Maybe they weren't blessed with divine favor, but their other attributes more than made up for this. Of course, he wasn't convinced these humans were superior to his glorious race. After all, the divine is above all, including their magicless magic. Whatever these humans were, he was both eager and nervous to meet them. He was still a scholar at heart, and the opportunity to learn things, be that from beasts, his lesser or his peers, was still exciting. And so he entered the room, his 2 knights closely following him. He saw one of those humans in a steel suit of armor move around the room. It was almost like the suit itself was moving, and the human was merely controlling it, albeit not moving it around. In his hands he carried that strange device he had learned the humans called a plasma gun. Apparently that was how they decimated Halamond within 3 hours. In the center of the room was a desk. A fierce light shined throughout the entire room due to one of those lamps. Against the white wall were several tables with books, papers, and those infinite ink devices on them. Behind the desk was what Tricurius assumed to be head human diplomat, Patricia of House Williams. Like Carlson, she had dark, nigh-black hair. However, unlike Carlson, she had blue eyes instead of green ones. Humans, Tricurius had noticed, usually had far more rugged faces than most elves. Both Carlson and Patricia were no exception, and yet they still had that remarkably graceful stride, for a non-elf, of course. The woman smiled and beckoned him in. "Greetings, diplomat Tricurius," she said with a warm voice. "I assume everything has been to your liking?" she asked. Tricurius nodded politely. "Of course it has. I assume my presence hasn't been too much of strain on your resources," he asked. She nodded. "Not at all." She paused. "However, I am sure you haven't traveled from Reimstadt to here to exchange pleasantries," she said, looking at him more intensely. Tricurius put on an aloof expression and nodded. "Indeed I have not," he said. "I have come here to warn you of a threat most dire, one that will certainly spell doom lest you aid us in quelling it," he said. The armored soldier who was there from the beginning put off his helmet, revealing a heavily scarred face with one of those strange iron eyes. He whispered something in the human language to the leading diplomat. She whispered something back, however. Before she did so, she pressed a strange iron thing inside her ear. She then pressed the thing inside her ear again. "Please, go on," she said. The elf breathed in deeply. "The Aemoni, as you may know, have pillaged and raided their way across our steadfast and just imperium for centuries, if not millennia at this point. I urge you cull and purge them. They will do the same to you." He said, "They're simply sharpening their dagger, ready to stab you in the back with it when they see their opportunity, and then twist it so that you might never recover." His voice was stern. He had his eyes fixed on her, speaking with absolute clarity. The diplomat merely chuckled. "They raided and pillaged their way across your imperium after your founder slaughtered them like cattle. Then you retaliated. They in turn started raiding and pillaging as revenge," she said. She went from her laid-back position to sitting straight up. "This created a vicious, nigh unbreakable cycle," she continued. "One that without a more powerful third party simply is unbreakable. However, I intend to break it." Her voice went from a warm tone to one determined to do whatever it took to accomplish her goals. She stood up. "Humanity is that incredibly powerful third party. We intend nothing but to ensure peace, prosperity, and prevent the annihilation of all," she said. "Perhaps that was the only thing that we learnt from the destruction of Earth," she said somberly. "Destruction of Earth?" As in the material, the humans destroyed all of Earth. Tricurius let it sink in for a few moments. With no Earth, there would be no crops, no cattle grazing, and thus no food. How did they? Humans were an anathema. Tricurius didn't even need to think about it. However, were these humans really as powerful as they thought? They had the element of surprise at Halamund after all. Not just that, but they could prepare their attack. "You suppose humanity is powerful enough to conquer all of the Imperium, let alone Naravor?" he asked. It was a genuine question. These humans were powerful. Nobody doubted that anymore. But how powerful were they, actually? Patricia looked at him. "Within 3 hours we captured Halamund, with 30 soldiers," she said. "We have mastered the sky, the sea, the land, and even space itself. We can destroy your entire world within the press of a button. We are choosing to give you the choice of peace." Pausing for a moment, she continued shortly afterwards, "We choose to be better, because we know what happens when you actually use those tools of mass destruction. We know the suffering and misery that kind of warfare will bring," she said firmly. She put her fist down. "Billions, if not trillions, died for our planet. Even more died after that trying to find refuge amongst the stars," she said in a harsh tone. 98% of the entire population lay dead. And for what? For the glory of some government who saved themselves before their people? For the privilege of owning a wasteland, broken, molested, and uninhabitable due to unrelenting warfare? You came here with a request, and I shall send you back to your petty emperor with a request of my own. End your petty squabble. You're both wrong. It doesn't matter who started. It only matters who will end this ridiculous conflict of yours." Tricurius didn't know what to say. Of course, the Imperium was right. There was no debating that. Ryman conquered and civilized the Aemoni. He didn't slaughter them. He improved their miserable standard of living. And what did he get for his forgiveness, his mercy? He got this. Ungrateful bastards. They dared involve these humans. These madmen could blow up entire worlds. They overpowered all of Naravor by a lot there. Maybe, just maybe, if they gathered every sorcerer in Naravor, sacrificed everyone for Ternitia, They might just be able to pull something like that off. However, to do such a thing with the press of a button, well, that's dangerous. What if that button falls into the hands of the wrong person? What then? The human sighed and nodded. Even though I disagree with your reasons on why, I do agree with your general idea. You shall be invited to next week's negotiations. The elf grinned victoriously, starting an argument with an elf. What a foolish decision. Besides being expert magicians, elves were known for their mental prowess, being able to out-hink any race. This, along with their divine heritage, also contributed to their magical prowess. I beg you don't do this. This highfalutin will surely sabotage the negotiations. You can't trust them with their evil trickery, the Imana yelled. The human shook her head. As I've already said, Ambassador Harasu of House Narasis, I see you as equals, and thus give you the exact same privileges and rights. Besides, we're not here to play favorites. We're here to establish a lasting peace. The ambassador, who was apparently called Harasu, was simply fuming. It wouldn't surprise Tracurius if he'd charged the human ambassador. However, she was still stoic. The guard to the right, however, had raised that contraption of his. The moment he did that, Harasu took a step back, and with a mean look on his face, walked out of the room. Ambassador, you two are dismissed. I will have Carlson bring you the documents needed to attend the negotiations, she said politely. The elf nodded and turned around, a smug smile on his face. His knights followed him eagerly. Once they had exited the room, he discussed with his knights what he would do. He himself would most likely go to his quarters and wait for Carlson to deliver his documents, after which he would try to scour the entire castle for information about the humans, anything to turn the negotiations into his favor. There was a long road ahead of him. However he felt great, he did it. He ensured he would at least have some say in the upcoming negotiations. He ensured the Imperium and, by extension, civilization would have some say.